A quiet night in Harlem turns explosive when a black man is humiliated by a racist cop who thinks he's above the law. But the officer has no idea. His so-called suspect is actually the newly appointed U.S. Attorney for New York. What begins as police brutality quickly spirals into a courtroom firestorm, national outrage, and a reckoning the NYPD never saw coming. Stay tuned. This is one fight for justice you won't forget. On a dreary, rain-drenched night in Amsterdam, the narrow streets of the Jordan district glistened under flickering streetlights. The city, known for its picturesque canals and progressive charm, hid a darker undercurrent that night, one that would soon ripple far beyond its cobblestone paths. The wind howled, carrying sheets of rain that battered the windows of quaint brownstone houses and sent pedestrians scurrying for cover. It was just past midnight when Officer Pieter van der Meer, a wiry man with a permanent scowl etched into his pale face, spotted him. The man was walking alone, his hood pulled tight against the storm, hands shoved deep into the pockets of a worn leather jacket. To Pieter, he stood out like a smudge on a clean canvas. Too dark, too foreign, too wrong for this part of town. The officer's instincts, honed by years of unchecked biases and a quiet resentment toward the growing diversity of his city, kicked in. He didn't need evidence. The man's skin color and casual stride were enough. "Hey, you!" Pieter barked, his voice cutting through the rain as he stepped out of his patrol car, flashlight in hand. The beam caught the man's face, sharp cheekbones, a trimmed beard, and eyes that narrowed against the glare. He stopped, turning slowly, water dripping from the edge of his hood. "Me?" the man asked, his voice calm but edged with something Pieter couldn't place. His accent was American, crisp and deliberate, not the broken Dutch of the immigrants Pieter usually targeted. "Yeah, you," Pieter sneered, closing the distance. "What are you doing out here? Looking for trouble?" He shone the light directly into the man's eyes, forcing him to squint. The rain plastered Pieter's blonde hair to his forehead, but he didn't care. This was his street, his rules. "I'm walking home," the man replied evenly, hands still in his pockets. "Is that a crime now?" Pieter smirked, the kind of grin that carried years of entitlement. "It is when you look like you do. Papers. Now." He thrust out a gloved hand, expecting compliance. When the man didn't move, Pieter's smirk faded. "I said now, or I'll drag you to the station myself." The man exhaled, a slow breath that misted in the cold air. "You're making a mistake," he said, almost too quietly to hear over the rain. But Pieter wasn't listening. He grabbed the man's arm, yanking it from his pocket, and twisted it behind his back. The man didn't resist, but his silence only fueled Pieter's anger. "Think you're tough, huh?" Pieter spat, literally sending a gob of saliva that landed on the man's cheek. He shoved him against the wet brick wall of a nearby alley, cuffing his wrists with a satisfying click. "You people always think you belong here. Well, you don't." The man's jaw tightened, but he said nothing as Pieter radioed for backup. Within minutes, another officer arrived, and they hauled him into the back of the patrol car. The rain pounded the roof as they drove to the precinct, Pieter muttering slurs under his breath, while his partner stayed silent. To them, this was routine. A black man in the wrong place at the wrong time, another notch in their belt. What Pieter didn't know, what he couldn't have known, was that the man in the back seat wasn't just some random target. His name was Marcus Jackson, and he wasn't a petty criminal or an undocumented migrant. He was the newly appointed senior legal advisor to the International Criminal Court in The Hague, a position he'd earned through decades of brilliance, grit, and an unyielding fight against injustice. And this night, This humiliating arrest was about to ignite a firestorm that would shake Amsterdam and the world to its core. At the precinct, Marcus sat in a dimly lit holding cell, his soaked jacket clinging to his frame. Pieter had taken his wallet, phone, and keys, tossing them into an evidence bag with a smirk. "We'll figure out who you really are soon enough," he'd said before slamming the cell door. Marcus didn't protest. He didn't shout or demand a lawyer. He just sat there, staring at the cracked concrete floor, his mind already working. The desk sergeant, a tired woman named Lisbeth, eventually pulled up Marcus's ID from the system. Her eyes widened as she read the screen. "Pieter," she called, her voice tight. "You need to see this." "What now?" Pieter grumbled, swaggering over. He glanced at the monitor and froze. The name Marcus Jackson stared back at him, alongside a title that made his stomach drop. Senior Legal Advisor, International Criminal Court. A quick search confirmed it. Articles, photos, a press release from The Hague dated just 2 weeks ago. This wasn't a nobody. This was a man with power, connections, and a reputation that spanned continents. "Shit," Pieter muttered, his bravado evaporating. "How was I supposed to know?" "You weren't," Lisbeth snapped, already reaching for the phone. "But you're in deep now." By morning, the story had leaked. A bystander with a phone camera had caught the arrest. Pieter's spit, the cuffs, the shove against the wall, and uploaded it to X. The video spread like wildfire. Hashtags like #Justice for Marcus and #Racism in Amsterdam trending within hours. News outlets from BBC to NOS picked it up, and the quiet streets of Jordan became a media circus. Protesters gathered outside the precinct, chanting Marcus's name, while politicians scrambled to distance themselves from the scandal. For Marcus, it wasn't about revenge. It never had been. Released after a hasty apology from a red-faced police chief, he stood before a sea of microphones, rain still dripping from his coat. "This isn't just about me," he said, his voice steady but resonant. "This is about every person who's been stopped, humiliated, or worse because of how they look. It's about a system that lets it happen. And it ends now." The days following Marcus Jackson's arrest were a blur of chaos in Amsterdam. The viral video had cracked open a fault line that ran through the city's polished exterior, exposing the raw nerve of racial tension that many preferred to ignore. Protests swelled, spilling from Jordan into Dam Square, where students, activists, and immigrants waved signs reading, "No justice, no peace, and end profiling now." The rain hadn't stopped, as if the sky itself were mourning or warning of what was to come. Marcus didn't waste time. Back in his sleek apartment overlooking the Amstel River, he sat at a glass desk, laptop open, drafting a legal complaint that would hit the Amsterdam police like a sledgehammer. His role at the International Criminal Court didn't give him jurisdiction over local law enforcement, but his expertise and network did. He'd spent his career dismantling corrupt systems, first as a civil rights attorney in Chicago, then as a prosecutor in New York. And he knew how to turn a personal injustice into a public reckoning. His phone buzzed incessantly. Calls from colleagues in The Hague, reporters begging for interviews, even a terse voicemail from the U.S. ambassador offering support. But Marcus wasn't interested in platitudes. He wanted action. By noon, he'd filed a formal complaint with the Dutch Public Prosecution Service, alleging racial profiling, excessive force, and false arrest. He named Officer Pieter van der Meer as the primary defendant, attaching the video evidence and a list of witnesses, including the bystander who'd filmed it all, a young barista named Sophie who'd already agreed to testify. The news hit Pieter like a punch to the gut. Holed up in his cramped apartment on the outskirts of the city, he watched the headlines roll in on his phone. Rogue cop faces lawsuit after viral arrest, and ICC advisor targeted in racist incident. His hands shook as he scrolled through X, where users were digging into his past. Old posts complaining about outsiders, and a blurry photo of him at a far-right rally years ago. He'd always thought his biases were normal, shared quietly among colleagues over beers. Now they were a noose tightening around his neck. At the precinct, his superiors were in damage control mode. The police chief, a stern man named Hendrik de Vries, called Pieter into his office. "You've screwed us all," Hendrik growled, slamming a fist on his desk. "Do you have any idea who this guy is? He's not some nobody you can sweep under the rug." "I didn't know," Pieter protested, his voice cracking. He looked suspicious, hood up, alone at night. "What was I supposed to do?" "Use your damn brain," Hendrik snapped. "We're suspending you, effective immediately. Investigations pending. Get out." Pieter stormed out, fury and fear warring in his chest. He didn't see himself as a villain, just a cop doing his job in a city that felt less like his own every day. But the world didn't care about his excuses, and neither did Marcus. The courtroom battle began 2 weeks later in a sleek, modern building near Amsterdam's Central Station. The case had ballooned into a national spectacle, drawing crowds of supporters and detractors alike. Marcus, dressed in a tailored suit, stood before the judge, a stern woman named Judge Anneliese Bakker, flanked by a team of pro bono lawyers who'd jumped at the chance to work with him. Across the room, Pieter sat with his union-appointed attorney, a sweaty man named Jeroen, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. The prosecution laid out their case with surgical precision. Marcus recounted the night in vivid detail: the flashlight in his face, the spit on his cheek, the cuffs biting into his wrists. Sophie, the barista, took the stand, her voice trembling but resolute as she described Pieter's aggression. The video played on a large screen, its grainy footage silencing the room. Pieter's sneering voice, the thud of Marcus hitting the wall, the casual cruelty of it all. Pieter's defense was shaky. Jeroen argued that the officer had acted in good faith, citing the late hour and Marcus's evasive behavior. But under cross-examination, Pieter crumbled. "I thought he was trouble," he admitted, voice low. "You see guys like him all the time. Dealers, thieves. I was protecting the neighborhood." "Guys like him?" Marcus's lead attorney, a sharp-tongued woman named Elise, pressed. "You mean black men?" Pieter flinched. "I didn't say that." "You didn't have to," Elise shot back, turning to the judge. "This is textbook profiling, Your Honor. Officer Meer abused his authority based on nothing but prejudice." The courtroom buzzed. Judge Bakker's expression remained unreadable, but the weight of the evidence was clear. Outside, the protests grew louder, chants echoing through the glass walls. Marcus glanced at the crowd through a window, hundreds of faces, many of them brown and black, staring back with hope and anger. This wasn't just his fight anymore. Back at the ICC in The Hague, Marcus's colleagues watched the case unfold with a mix of awe and unease. His boss, Director Claire Moreau, pulled him aside one evening. "You're stirring a hornet's nest," she said, her French accent clipped. "The Dutch government's already pressuring us to rein you in. They say it's bad optics for the court." "They can pressure all they want," Marcus replied, arms crossed. "I'm not backing down." Claire sighed. "I admire your fire, Marcus, but be careful. This could cost you more than you think." She was right to worry. The case wasn't just about Pieter anymore. It was exposing rot in the system. Internal police records, leaked by a whistleblower, showed dozens of similar incidents. Black and Middle Eastern residents disproportionately stopped, frisked, and arrested. Activists seized on the data, demanding reform, while far-right groups rallied in Pieter's defense, claiming he was a scapegoat for woke politics. Amsterdam, a city that prided itself on tolerance, was tearing at the seams. The courtroom was a pressure cooker by the final day of the trial. The air hummed with anticipation as reporters crammed into the back rows, their pens scratching furiously, while protesters outside chanted Marcus's name in a rhythmic roar. Inside, the atmosphere was electric. Every word, every glance weighed with the gravity of what this case had become. It wasn't just about one rainy night anymore. It was a referendum on a city, a system, and the unspoken rules that governed both. Marcus sat at the plaintiff's table, his face composed but his eyes burning with purpose. He'd spent sleepless nights preparing for this, poring over legal precedents and witness statements, knowing the world was watching. Across the room, Pieter slumped in his chair, his once arrogant posture replaced by a hollow-eyed exhaustion. The past weeks had stripped him bare. His suspension, the public shaming, the death threats from strangers who saw him as a symbol of everything wrong with the police. He barely recognized himself anymore. Judge Anneliese Bakker entered, her black robe sweeping the floor like a shadow. She adjusted her glasses and addressed the room. After careful consideration of the evidence, testimonies, and arguments presented, I am ready to deliver my ruling. The silence was deafening. She began with the facts. The video, Pieter's actions, the lack of probable cause. Officer Vandermeer's conduct on the night of October 17th was a clear violation of protocol, she said, her voice steady. His decision to detain Mr. Jackson was based not on evidence, but on assumptions rooted in racial bias, a practice that has no place in a just society. Pieter's attorney, Jeroen, shifted uncomfortably, but Marcus kept his gaze on the judge. She wasn't done. However, she continued, this court must also consider intent. The prosecution has not proven beyond reasonable doubt that Officer Vandermeer acted with malicious intent to harm Mr. Jackson specifically. As such, the charge of excessive force is not fully substantiated. A murmur rippled through the room. Marcus's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. Judge Bakker raised a hand for silence. That said, the evidence of wrongful arrest and racial profiling is overwhelming. Officer Vandermeer is hereby found liable for damages to Mr. Jackson in the amount of $50,000. Furthermore, this court recommends a full investigation into the Amsterdam Police Department's practices to be overseen by an independent commission. The gavel fell, and the room erupted. Cheers from Marcus's supporters clashed with groans from Pieter's dwindling allies. Outside, the crowd exploded into celebration, horns blaring as the rain finally broke, giving way to a watery sun. Marcus stepped out onto the courthouse steps, flanked by his legal team, and faced a sea of cameras. "This isn't a victory for me," he said, his voice cutting through the noise. "It's a start for everyone who's been ignored, harassed, or silenced. But the work's not done. Not here, not anywhere." He paused, letting the words sink in. Change doesn't come from one courtroom. It comes from all of us. For Pieter, the verdict was a gut punch. He avoided the press, slipping out a side exit where his partner, a quiet officer named Bram, waited in an unmarked car. "What now?" Bram asked, eyes on the road as they pulled away. "I don't know," Pieter muttered, staring out the window at the city he'd sworn to protect. A city that now felt like it had turned its back on him. The investigation would likely end his career, and the $50,000 fine would drain his savings. But worse than that was the mirror the trial had held up to him. He'd always told himself he wasn't racist, just cautious, just practical. Now he wasn't so sure. Back at home, he sat alone in the dark, replaying the arrest in his mind. The spit, the cuffs, the sneer. Had he really believed Marcus was a threat? Or had he just wanted to feel powerful? For the first time, he opened X and read the comments under the video, not the hate mail from his defenders, but the stories from others. A Moroccan shopkeeper stopped weakly. A Somali student frisked on her way to class. Each one chipped away at the wall he'd built around his conscience. The ripple effects were immediate. The independent commission launched within days, pulling records and interviewing officers under a spotlight that made the precinct squirm. Whistleblowers emerged, corroborating the leaked data Marcus had used, patterns of profiling stretching back years. The police chief, Hendrik de Vries, resigned under pressure, replaced by a reformer who promised transparency. Protests evolved into town halls, where citizens demanded accountability, their voices too loud to ignore. Marcus returned to The Hague, his ICC work now shadowed by his new role as a reluctant symbol. Director Claire Moreau greeted him with a wry smile. "You've made enemies, but you've also made history," she said. "What's next?" "Keep pushing," Marcus replied simply. He knew the verdict was a step, not a solution. Racism didn't vanish with a gavel's bang. It lingered in quiet corners, in unchecked assumptions, in systems too comfortable to change. But he also saw the spark it had lit. The young activists organizing, the officers rethinking their biases, the city waking up. Months later, Amsterdam felt different, not healed, but restless, like a wound beginning to scar. Marcus walked the Jordan streets again, hood up against a light drizzle, unnoticed by the passers-by who'd once cheered his name. He passed the alley where it all began, now marked with a mural, a raised fist in black and gold, the words "See Us" scrawled beneath it. At the same time, Pieter sat in a community center across town, part of a mandatory retraining program for officers under review. The facilitator, a soft-spoken woman of Surinamese descent, asked the group, "Why do you think people fear you?" Pieter didn't answer, but the question lodged in his chest like a stone. The story didn't end there, because it couldn't. Marcus's fight, Pieter's reckoning, the city's awakening, they were threads in a larger tapestry, stretching beyond Amsterdam to every place where power clashed with justice. The rain might stop, the headlines might fade, but the questions remained. Who decides who belongs? Who pays for the past? And what happens when the silenced start to speak?